People think they're trying to be uplifting and keep it moving, but it can become toxic, especially from leadership, when these are the only types of messages allowed, when you're only allowed to have a good day. Because that's not normal, that's not healthy, and it certainly doesn't support mental health. Because all of us, normal human adults, have ups and downs that we have to manage. And so you want to say things instead like, it's okay to have a bad day, I'm here for you. Not every circumstance needs a silver lining.
Welcome to Vibecast, the podcast that dives deep into the heartbeat of workplace culture. I'm your host, Christy Skutnik. Join me in conversations with extraordinary leaders as we unravel their experiences, both positive and negative, that have impacted workplace culture. This podcast is more than storytelling. It's about actionable insights. Are you ready to transform the vibe at your workplace? Let's go. Today, I got to chat with Andrea Herron. Andrea is the VP of HR at WebMD, an executive coach, a published author of There's an Elephant in Your Office, a keynote speaker, and host of the podcast, The HR Scoop. She was honored with Ragan's Top Women in Wellness and HR Award, selected as an agent of change in American Healthcare Leader magazine, and a top leader in DEIB by Mogul. She lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband and 2 kids, and I cannot wait for you to listen in and hear more. Andrea, thank you for being here. I'm grateful that we got connected, and I think this is a super important topic around creating vibes, but what mental health in the workplace and just in life, I would say, and how that can impact the vibe. And so how I always start out with every guest is just understanding kind of at the ground level of how you define a vibe. So I'd love to hear from your perspective what that means to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be here with you. And I love the word vibe. I use it all the time, but as I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure what it means. I think it's the feel. It's right, like it's that intuitive feel of how things really work and how you are experiencing a situation. It's kind of like the word culture. I'm not sure what the definition of that really is, but we all know it's a shared experience. I think a vibe is very similar.
I mean, that's why I love the word vibe, because everybody can they know it when they feel it, but everyone's kind of essence of what it is slightly different, I think, depending on the experiences that they've had. So thank you. So I just would love to dive into your story. You have such a unique story, and one that I think is so, I don't even know all the details just from our initial conversation, but I'd love to, hear more about your kind of journey to the place that you're at today, defining moment of why vibes in the workplace have become important to you, and how you've been able to impact those vibes through the various different things you've done around mental health, even to the extent of writing a book.
Sometimes when people say, oh, what's the one topic you could stand up and give a TED Talk on right now? And I feel like mine is mental health in the workplace. And so I appreciate being able to talk about it here. So I do HR, and I've done HR for almost 20 years now. So I've seen some things, and I know that people are all over the spectrum with physical and mental wellness, but we really haven't talked about it much before really the pandemic years. But for me personally, it started a little bit before that. So a handful of years now ago, I got a call from my sister, and she was freaking out. Like, I've never heard her freaking out. And she called me and she was like, I'm going to get fired. It's like, whoa, what? You're going to get fired? Like, that's a big deal. And so she was calling me, her sister in HR, for some advice. And out came this, like a volcano erupting, this diatribe of my anxiety and my depression are bad, and I'm working with my therapist, but my medication needs to change and it's taking too long and I can't do my job and I've got a work plan, but I'm not doing it and I'm going to get fired. And I was like, what? I had no idea she had anxiety or depression to begin with, much less that it had escalated to a point where it was impacting her job that much. Because of the stigma and shame, she had never shared that even with her family. She had hidden that her whole life, which made me really sad that I couldn't be there for her before, but also really happy that I could be there for her at that time. And what I found when I started diving in to see what I could do to help her was a canyon-sized gap in information, and it was really, like, legal case studies or ADA documentation, which talk about boring. I mean, that is bedtime reading, right? That is not helpful.
Yeah. Well, and it's just sometimes so unrealistic to apply.
Not really helpful, especially when she's in the situation and she's like, "Is there anything I can do? I can ask HR, I can share with my manager." So really coming at it from the employee's view, which is even further away from the ADA law, right? And so thankfully, we were able to get her an accommodation and reduce her work hours for a time while she sorted that out. And it took courage for her to be upfront about what was going on. And then there were a lot more options. But this was pre-pandemic, right? So that was really scary. And what I realized and was a huge wake-up call for me was that if I didn't know my very own sister was struggling with this, I most certainly had no idea what was going on in my employee group. And so it really let me feel that personally, which I think is how a lot of these passion projects start. And ever since, we've been on a mission to improve it. And as you mentioned, once we kind of got her through that, we decided to write a book to help fill in that gap. And we wrote it together, which was actually really fun, from the perspective of someone having a mental illness in the workplace and from the perspective of HR and business and what to actually do about it with tactical help. So if we had had that book, we could have, gotten there a lot faster.
Yeah. How did kind of going back, because I want to go back to the book, but how did the organization respond when your sister had the courage to speak up?
Yeah. Well, I think it was tough because there was still a lot of stigma and shame around that, and they didn't really know how to handle it. If I'm just being totally honest, I think they did what most of us would have done. Like, oh, wow, okay, I read about that. That is serious. There's laws around that. I don't want to mess that up. So it became very, let me check, let me talk to HR. It became a thing versus just, oh, okay, now we know what to do.
Yeah, more like a process and like a facilitation, but like maybe with unmet feelings.
Yeah, like, okay, well, now we have to deal with this. This isn't just we can let you go for poor performance.
Right, right, definitely. Was she able to work through that? Was the organization supportive of that? Was she, like, led by good people, that got her out of it? Because I know it can go both ways, right? I've talked to so many people in my HR career and just through the podcast that have said, like, I would have never made it through if I didn't have this one person, right? Or I didn't have this one person, and so it was an absolute disaster. It almost changed the trajectory of my career because I started doubting myself. Was I even capable anymore? So, like, did she have that person? Did you connect her with a person? Like, how did that unfold?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think it was truly a mixed bag. I think her manager was nervous, disappointed, maybe frustrated that my sister was working less hours. Maybe that meant she had to take on more work or more responsibility. So I think it was a little less than ideal, but knew it had to happen that way. And the HR person was very supportive and did help make that difference of like, no, we are going to work this out. You've been a great employee here for over 5 years. This is clearly not your usual. So we know something's going on and we're going to help you get through it and change your hours for this time or make it work. And so I think she had both experiences.
Okay, so then you guys decide to write a book because there really isn't anything out there, right? Talking about kind of like some of the tactics and bridging that gap. So, how did you go about figuring out how to bridge that gap? Because it's somewhat new territory.
It really just my mind opened and flooded with examples once I kind of gave that perspective of how many things I had helped people with and just never really made the connection to. And interestingly, while we were writing the book, I had several more interactions that were pretty significant and was able to kind of write about them anonymously, of course.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, it's always the challenge being in HR, right? You're like, "I have so many stories and they're all confidential."
right. Names, genders,
Yeah.
places, spaces, take nothing for real life. Although the story is true, right?
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was actually people ask me sometimes, like, oh, how was it writing a book with your sister? But it was really easy because she had a certain perspective from her view that I didn't have. And I had a certain perspective of tools and HR that she didn't have. It didn't hurt that she was an English major and PR and marketing person. So I basically brain dumped all my ideas and stories to her. And then she worked her magic. Definitely want to give her full, editorial credit there.
Yeah, yeah. That's awesome. And then, okay, so talk to me about because you brought up an interesting point that as you're writing the book, you almost seem to get like a flood of interesting situations or maybe applicable situations. It's almost like once you open your heart and your mind to stuff like that, things come to you. I talk to leaders about this all the time of like, you have to be ready to see the goodness in front of you. You have to be ready to explore conversations because if you don't walk into a situation ready, you're not going to see it and you're not going to be able to engage with it. So, it's really interesting that you say that, right? That all of a sudden you started seeing these things in front of you. Are you able to share one of those stories? I mean, keep everybody anonymous and all the like, but I'd love to hear a story of like how you led somebody through that once you started, you know, becoming more aware of like this happening in front of you.
Sure. Yeah. And the other interesting thing is the stories are coming from the employees, but so were the opportunities to help managers and use some ideas and tools real time. And not on purpose were we testing material as we were writing the book, but it just so happened that way. And so I feel like the tools and mechanisms we give people actually work because I tested them as we were going. So, one example that I think is a really clear illustration of both sides of that, I had an employee who had been with us a long time and all of a sudden was acting a bit erratic, would be missing for a few days and then would show up and work 12 to 16 hours in a day and just be really all over the place and unusual. So that is one sign that we talk about is it's a departure from baseline performance, right? Something is different. And we knew something was different, but performance wasn't suffering. This was a salary exempt employee. So, the work was getting done. Now, going missing for a few days, that was concerning on a human level. So, one day, the employee had been gone for 3 days, and we were getting really concerned. And we had another employee that was connected to her and let us know that she was in the hospital. And so that does happen. And so, we were able to get some information and she had gone into the hospital for bipolar disorder and she was really manic. And so she was in a safe place and getting medication that she needed, but it explained the erratic up and down and the manic and the highs and the lows and we had no idea she had that before because she had always managed it very well. So then, okay, in the hospital, what accommodations do you need? What does a return to work schedule look like? What do we tell the team that you've been gone for mysteriously for days? They're worried and you're going to continue to be gone. So we don't want to share your business, but we have to say something because they care. And so, you have to figure out a way to share without sharing any personal information. And then on the flip side, on the manager, this manager cared a whole lot and was very concerned, as you would expect, in trying to navigate these really uncharted territories that she had never experienced before. And so I did a lot of coaching with her on how to talk to the team, how to just, you know what, this is the reality. It is short term. Is there anyone that needs a stretch assignment that could take on this level work that would be exciting versus just dumping work? How can we bridge that gap. And also, this was really, really important. How does that manager not take responsibility for whatever the outcome is of that person returning and being successful or not? Because they cared a lot. And I'm like, you're caring, and I love that you're caring, but this is an adult and they are responsible for getting themselves, and we will do everything we can to support them. But you are not ultimately responsible for their success of coming back or not. And that was actually a really hard lesson for that manager.
Yeah. So there's 2 things you said. The first one, like, distinguishing from the usual, right? And so in your experience, how have you been able to coach leaders that have reported to you or coach leaders that you work with often to be, because we all get we're in like 3 times as many meetings than we've ever been in, right, post-pandemic, and so maybe if you go back to the beginning, I think you mentioned 2017, right? Maybe this wasn't as much of an issue, but fast forward to now, we're in all these meetings on Zoom, remote, sometimes in office with people, sometimes not, sometimes working with far off lands, right? And so how do you coach managers and leaders into pausing and getting to know their people and pausing to understand what's usual and what's unusual? Because I have seen a trend that this is seemingly not revolutionary, but not the norm.
I have so much to say about this. Okay, so all of your points are so valid. So we published this book in 2019. 2020, the world flipped upside down, right? So in 2022, we actually published a second edition that included remote work. So it included, how do you notice if we're on a screen? So a couple of in-person and remote examples I'll give, and then you talk about relationship building. So you have to understand the baseline. If someone usually turns things in on time and all of a sudden it's getting late regularly, that might be a sign that something is going on. If someone usually, let's say you're in person, comes in, says good morning, kind of greets everyone, and now they go straight to their desk, they're not saying a word. That could be a sign that something is going on that you might want to check in on. When we're remote, it could look totally different. Right, there's no shame in the sweatpants game, but if somebody looks disheveled and unprofessional, even for an internal meeting, or their hygiene has kind of gone to the side when usually they're very put together, they might be struggling. If they're usually camera on, now they're camera off. If now all of a sudden they're talking about gambling again, or their 800th package being delivered, or they picked up smoking, some unhealthy coping mechanisms, that could be a sign that, they're just having a hard time. And that's where you want to check in.
And then the next piece of that is, how do you share with them, or, the next piece of feedback I always get is like, "I'm way too busy, like, I don't have time in my calendar to check in." Or maybe it's gonna be like a week from now, and that might be too late. Or so how do you recommend people making the time to do that?
Yes. Okay. Two things on that. One, the key phrase that I want, especially managers, but it could be coworkers too, to use is "I've noticed." Okay, so that's going to keep us away from personal assumptions, from the rumor mill, from the gossip, and keep it workplace behavior specific, right? "I've noticed that you usually turn things in and now you are late," things like that. So "I've noticed," when you do have those conversations, is super helpful phrase to keep it on the legal side. But as far as building relationships, it takes time and effort. But my best tip for kind of speed style relationship building is called the Take 10 check in. The idea is there are 3 questions that should take less than 10 minutes, and you could use them in a regular one on one, a skip level meeting, or even when you bump into someone. And the questions are, how are you doing? Which you will get some type of information based on how much they trust you and how much they think you're actually asking. You're probably going to have to ask twice, right? Like, how are you? Good, busy, right? Like, no, no. How are you? Oh, you actually care. Okay. So now they give you an answer. But the second question is, how is the team? This is the money question because as humans, we so graciously project our own expectations and assumptions and perspective onto other people. It's so nice of us. And so when you ask that question, how's the team doing? You're going to get that person's perspective of, yes, the team, but also part of their experience that they may not have felt comfortable being so direct about. So that is crucial. So, how are you doing? How's the team doing? How can I help? And if they give you something to help and you help, I mean, that is immediately going to build trust and follow up.
Yeah, and then I would even say after that, if once you start building the relationship, you can even start asking some deeper questions, right? To get to know them and to get to understand who they are, what they're about. I was on a call recently and there was somebody I was coaching and talking to, and it took some time, but then they shared with me like so many things about their personal life that lend to behaviors in the workplace that I wouldn't have otherwise known without building that relationship, but it was very eye-opening too because as somebody coaching them was gonna help me, like, understand them a bit more on a personal level so that I can get to them, maybe not quicker, but better and more effective. So, yeah, getting to know your people, man, the value in that, and that's really hard remotely, especially if you have new team members onboarding and it can take longer for a person who isn't naturally inclined to build relationships, you know. For us extroverts, maybe a little bit simpler, but
It is a skill and it does just take time and effort, but time doesn't have to be an hour. You can start with the 10 minutes and then as you build, like you said, ask another question or, you'll just learn more, which helps you put the pieces together about that person more. And then you'll have experiences together that you can build on over time.
okay, so you're walking through this journey with your sister, you're writing the book, you have your own situations that you encounter as an HR leader. So you turn the corner, right? And then how do you maintain this? So when you're, you know, not seeing an unusual behavior, but you wanna have some maintenance in checking in and ensuring that you're supporting people in their mental health journey because situations arise all the time. So what does that look like as a leader?
Yeah, I think it's always putting people first. I mean, it is so easy to get distracted in our meeting to meeting calendar and just get to work and just check the boxes. And true business success comes through people. And if you're not putting the people first, your business will suffer. And I think that is little opposite to how some people think, right? Like, no, we've got to get it done. We've got to sign the contract. We've got to move forward, which you do. But the more you can stop and engage people and even chit chat for 2 minutes at the beginning of the meeting, say, "Hey, what's going well? Is there anything you're worried about? Is there anything I can help with in our time together?" That shows that you care, and it's those connections that when someone is having a hard time, they're gonna feel more comfortable coming to you. Another big one that I think so many people unintentionally fall into is toxic positivity. I love talking about this because everybody means well, but toxic positivity sounds like posy vibes only. Every day is a good day if you make it that way. It could be worse, right? And so if you've said these things and you're listening, don't panic. These things are not inherently bad. Like I said, they're very well intentioned, right? People think they're trying to be uplifting and keep it moving, but it can become toxic, especially from leadership, when these are the only types of messages allowed, when you're only allowed to have a good day, because that's not normal, that's not healthy, and it certainly doesn't support mental health. Because all of us, normal human adults, have ups and downs that we have to manage. And so you want to say things instead like, it's okay to have a bad day. I'm here for you. Not every circumstance needs a silver lining. Things can get really tough. What can we do? This allows the full scope of humanity. And to be clear, it is not a get out of performance free card. Okay. But just understanding that people do have ups and downs. And if someone's having, a down day, that's okay. It'll pass if they feel supported and that they can be honest about it and move forward versus if they have to fake it and try and pretend like everything's fine and use up all that energy instead of focusing on the work.
Yeah. And I've seen this work really well when managers go first, right? Or leaders go first and share their vulnerable moment of maybe, and I don't mean complaining about the leaders above them or, knocking a strategy that the CEO has come up with or something like that, but I mean, like, yesterday was a tough day with my kids. We had sports and we had homework and one isn't feeling well, and I am just not at my best today. So, like, if you can grant me some grace, those types of conversations. I mean, I'm sure there's a million more out there, but I think leaders are so often think that they have to maintain composure as if they're not human. So, sharing their own story can help with other people being open to sharing their story too.
100%. So, the number one indicator of a psychologically safe culture is if leaders admit mistakes and talk about personal stories, because it gives people permission to do the same and reassurance that they're not going to get fired or have, some discipline or be called out if they make a mistake or if they have a bad day. So this again doesn't mean bearing your soul, but if you make a mistake, acknowledging it and talking about it, or if you're just having a bad day, calling it out, like, hey, I'm sorry if I'm a little snippy today. I didn't get much sleep. I was up all night with XYZ. Then people can know where you are. And then they feel like if they have that day, it's going to be okay too.
Have you experienced or in any of your journey where a leader is just not these things and the impact that it had on the vibe?
Of course. People,
Are you willing to share?
and sure, sure. I think it's very common, right? Humans have all sorts of different backgrounds and comfort levels. And what I've seen really is people on both ends of the spectrum where they either go so direct that it is off putting, right? And it's too in your face, or they back so far off that it's passive aggressive and people don't know what to expect. And so when we don't have clear expectations or people aren't sharing, there's a vacuum of information. And in absence of information, humans make up the story. It is never positive. Our brains absolutely can't stand a gap in information. And so when you don't hear anything, you fill it in. I mean, I will admit, I'll put myself as this example. Early in my career, I would say to someone walking by, oh, hey, do you have a second? Could you come in my office? Oh, and shut the door. I know, it was so bad. I'm sorry to all those people. Fear, panic, right? They thought they were going to get fired when all I wanted to do was follow up on an idea they had or ask them a question I was interested in hearing their answer to, but they didn't know that. So when we set expectations and we are clear, it just goes so much better, especially those who do suffer from mental illness, because oftentimes work is the most stable place in their lives. It is the most stable experience they have. And when we throw a wrench in it and just change things up and don't give them time to prepare, send a meeting invite with 0 words inside of it, their anxiety spikes and they're nervous. Even if you know what the meeting is about, they don't. And then you're not going to get the best you can get from that person because they're not prepared. They're in a fear state. And so don't do what I did. Okay. If you're going to send a meeting invite, put at least one word or phrase in there. Brainstorming, Q4 planning, board preparation. I mean, just put something in there.
Gosh, that's such a great point, right? Because we think we've got it all figured out, like it's not a big deal. And then, but because of like role or status or relationships in the organization, people have an idea, and the majority of people come from a place of fear, honestly. If there's a leader asking them for something but not giving them much information, I actually use the tactic if I'm on a meeting and I'm catching somebody off guard or I reach out to them, I will actually say to them, "This meeting is not to fire you." Because I know that's like one of the first things that comes to mind, and I don't want them walking in anxious and like in defense mode. So, yeah, I think that's a great tip for leaders of like give them some clarity and communicate just a piece of what the meeting is going to be about so they don't think worst case scenario.
Yeah, and we all do it because we already know what the meeting's about. So oftentimes we're not even thinking about it, but you really proactively have to give them something to get the most out of the meeting, which is going to benefit you as well.
Okay, so going back to like sustainability, is there like a core value inside of you that like makes you constantly keep mental health a focus, right? So, like, what is at the core of you or the work that you do that you're like, this is so important to me because I believe X, Y, Z, whatever, right?
I think because I have experienced the employee side and that fear and panic response when someone just wants to show up and do a good job and is having a hard time, it really stuck with me. I always assume that people are doing their best, and their best may be 45% of what they could do otherwise. But I assume positive intent. I assume that people are trying until proven otherwise. I mean, 9 times out of 10, people are doing their best and trying to do a good job. And so I never assume I know what's going on in anyone's life because we don't. And I always assume that people are doing their best. And that really helps you see people as individuals and not get caught up in recency bias, and just all of the biases and the unconscious things that we have going on in our busy day. Human, right? There's no judgment there. But I really try to assume positive intent and that I have no idea what that person is going through.
Yeah, everybody comes to the day with a story behind them, right? I remember when my kids were young, and my oldest was really hard as a kid, and I dropped her off at preschool, and it was a hard morning, hard, and then I'd get in my car and I'd drive to work, and I would just like the tears would flow because then I'd feel bad about how the morning went. I haven't even started my day at work yet. And then I'm like, I think back to those days of like, what was the impact to my day? Because I'm sure there was something somewhere. Either I was mad at somebody or crying in somebody's office or, coming across really stern because I felt like I could control that piece of my life. Who knows? But then you think about that as, from a leadership perspective of you're coming into your day with all your things, and then your people are coming into their day with all their things. And then, yeah, as a leader, you almost have to like be the more mature one, I guess, to some degree to say like, "Okay, like, don't put it aside, but understand that that's not the intention of the other person just because that's your story walking into the day."
That's so real. And I think two things that help that from a leadership perspective are self care and boundaries. And yes, we've all heard it, but to me, self care means self respect. Take a bubble bath, whatever. But it's saying no to things that drain you and yes to things that energize you. Because when you're saying no to happy hour and yes to video games, or no to social media and yes to a book, no to that family event that's going to drain you, and yes to a walk with a friend, you're going to show up in a better place and you're going to be able to role model all these things we're talking about when you are taking care of you. You can't think of it as selfish. It's actually the opposite of selfish because it has a ripple effect either way, if you're taking care of yourself or if you're not. And the other one is boundaries. And look, humans, we're not that good at this, but to me, having strong boundaries is one of the most mature leadership competencies you can have. You're not sending emails on the weekend. You're setting time, you're blocking time for strategic planning. Maybe this is my favorite one. At the end of the year, you delete all your recurring meetings and intentionally decide which ones to add back. It's called green fielding.
And we're approaching the end of the year, and that with the statistic of, like, we're in 3 times as many meetings as we've ever been in before is probably the biggest blessing and gift anybody can receive.
Yeah, because there will be meetings that are absolutely worth it that you should keep. And then there are going to be meetings where you're like, oh, I always waffle. Should we have that one? Should we cancel it some of the time? Half the people show up. Don't have it and see what happens. So I think having those boundaries of using your time wisely and setting yourself up to feel good means that you're going to show up better and have more to give, which role models that out to everyone else.
I walked through this exercise with, some teams about doing, like, a personal mission statement, and I know it's, like, a big word and, but part of the beginning of that exercise is actually doing an energy audit like you talked about, and it's amazing because people walk away with that thinking, "Oh my gosh," and I preface it with, "This doesn't mean you just, like, walk away from your job your day job, right? And, like, well, that day job takes all of my it sucks all of the
Right.
energy, and so I don't wanna do it. This is, like, more foundational than that. Like, what fires you up, and what are you doing that doesn't? Like you said, maybe going to a family dinner with family members that just don't bring you joy is something that you feel an obligation to versus enjoying it, and there's a way to get out of it. Or maybe this piece of work that you're doing that you've been hanging on to, somebody on your team would love to do it. So just give it to them. Stop like holding it in yourself. So, yeah, it doesn't mean like, oh, everything I'm doing sucks and I'm just going to walk away from it. But I think it's intentionally looking at the activities of the day and where you spend your energy and deciding that you're going to spend more of your time of what like fires you up versus sucking the energy out of you.
Yes, it's getting off autopilot and being intentional about your time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. We've talked about so many good things here of like the 2 tactics that you can do, to recognize mental health, all these great things. But if there's one thing, one thing, and if you have 2, that's fine too. But one thing one thing as leaders are listening to this and they're walking away thinking, "Okay, there was so much goodness in that conversation, but I need to start somewhere and I just need one thing to know to go do next." It doesn't require a budget or a big group consensus or anything like that. Where would you tell them to start?
I think starting with yourself is going to be the biggest bang for your buck. So, doing the self care and the boundary work and being intentional would be a great place to start. And then, how authentic are you showing up? So, I think for leaders, oftentimes we get into these positions, perhaps they have big titles, and we feel like we have to put on the costume or the mask of what we think a insert title here should be. Okay, so I'll give you an example.
We're like shitting ourselves all over the
Yeah,
place.
don't shit yourself, it's terrible. And it makes you not as fun to be around, like, because 'cause you're not authentic, you're not as interesting as you actually are. So, I'll give you an example of another thing called invisible rules. If you don't know what invisible rules you're following, that might also be another place to start. Sorry, I've gone way over my one, but anyway. Um, well, invisible rules are rules that you have carried from other places that are not actually stated or even real, but you continue to follow them. So for me at my last employer, showing tattoos was a big no no, completely against the rules. And as a head of HR, I obviously followed that rule and covered my arm all the time, regardless of the season. In my new job, no one said that was a rule. It wasn't written down anywhere, but I brought that rule with me and I continued to cover my arm until one day we were at an offsite. It was in the summer and I went for a walk around the block and it was just too hot. I had to drop that sweater. And I literally ran into my boss and she was like, "Oh, you have like that. Is that new?" It's like, "No." Well, I've never seen it before. And I was like, "Well, I always keep it covered." Why? And I realized I didn't have a good answer for that, except I had brought that rule with me that didn't actually exist. And so from that day forward, I stopped covering it up. And guess what? It made me more interesting. It was something, a conversation starter. And also, it gave so many more people permission to not feel like they had to cover up their tattoo because maybe they had also brought that rule with them. So when you can just show up as who you are, you make deeper connections, maybe in places you wouldn't have expected, and you give people permission to do the same.
Yeah. Wow. That's so true. If I just think about like different clients I've had and leaders that I've supported and companies, that is all over the place. And it's, I think, sometimes really unintentional and really subconscious. So you have to dig deep to understand what truly those, like defining what those invisible rules are. But yeah. that could be really powerful.
Yeah, and it's self work that benefits your workplace, but also just you as a person. And it allows you to be freer in who you are everywhere you go, which again benefits yourself, your workplace, but also your friends and family.
Oh my gosh, so good, Andrea. I think we could keep talking forever and ever about this because there's just so much to talk through and get deep about. So I'm going to link your book in the show notes because I really think that there's an opportunity for people to understand tactically what to do when they're in this in between. Either they are the employee or they are the employer, and just like how to navigate mental health in the workplace to ensure that they're bringing the best of themselves and the best energy they can, vibes, if you will, to the workplace, whether they're managing a team of teams. There's just so, whether they're an individual contributor, but the ripple effect is just immense.
It's huge. Let's keep the vibe high, but not the toxic posy vibes.
That not the toxic positive vibes. Absolutely. Say no to toxic positive. I love that. Well, thank you for sharing your story and all the things with your sister. And I love that something, positive came out of such a what could have been really dark situation.
Yeah, me too. Thanks again for having me. It was such a delight.
I loved my conversation with Andrea and how we explored the significance of mental health in the workplace and how it influences the overall vibe of an organization. I'm also so grateful Andrea was able to share her personal journey, including her experiences in HR and her sister's struggle with mental health, which ultimately inspired her to write a book on the topic. At times, there can be such a stigma surrounding mental health, so it's important for organizations to support and equip leaders with practical strategies to recognize changes in their employees. Much of this can begin with building relationships and trust in the workplace to foster a supportive and connected environment. Andrea also brought up toxic positivity, the significance of self care and boundaries, and the impact of invisible rules on workplace culture. Again, some simple ways to change the narrative is for leaders to assume positive intent and be authentic in their interactions. Bottom line, be yourself and don't forget, people you interact with are human too. Allow them the time and space to be themselves and lead them to the resources they may need when they are struggling. Also, go check out Andrea's book. Thanks for listening and keep vibing, my friends. If this episode inspired you and you want to see how you can take the next step to creating a better vibe within your organization, I'd love for you to download our complimentary 75 Vibes worksheet. This is a simple tool to create a habit and mindset around creating great vibes in work and life. The best part, it's simple and it works.